Hey guys, Raven Knight here. Most of you are probably aware of this by now, but I am a huge Dracula fan. It's one of the first Gothic pieces of literature that I ever read, and I ended up teaching it when I became a teacher of a high school classroom. I became enthralled by the writing style, the horror elements, the character of Count Dracula, Abraham Van Helsing, Mina Harker, Jonathan Harker, all of them, and on and on and on down the list. Now, in recent years, the story of Dracula has come under fire and scrutiny for various reasons, and I've made it a point to stick up for my boy Drac. I've made a couple of response videos to folks comparing Dracula to Carmilla and trying to argue that Carmilla is better for just being lesbian, being female, and all those other reasons. And I also did a whole video on the history of Vlad Dracula himself to discuss the historical individual who inspired the vampire. So I think it's pretty safe to say I like Dracula. So I suppose if you were to ask me which horror movie monster I like the most, yeah, I guess vampires would probably fall at the top of the list. I know that they're kind of cliche now, and there's a lot of bad vampire media out there. I mean, like, a whole lot of bad vampire media. But I think because of my love for Dracula and a lot of the mythos around him, it just stands the test of time for me. So when one of my fans sent me a video on Discord about a supposed vampire expert reacting to movie and TV show representations of monsters, I was intrigued, so I went and watched the video. And all I can say is, this expert in question is admittedly well read, but is largely misguided, and you know what? I'll let her speak for herself. So once again, it's time to step up for the blood drinkers out there that I enjoy so much. But first, let's change my avatar. There we go. All right, let's get to it.
I'm Dr. Laura Westengard, and I'm a professor of English, Gothic literature, and gender and sexuality.
You didn't really need to tell me that last part. I think we all kind of figured that one out for ourselves.
I got my PhD focusing on Gothic themes and metaphors, but also how Gothic metaphors come through into contemporary culture.
You got your PhD in talking about Gothic themes and metaphors. No offense, but back when I was teaching high school, that's the kind of thing that I did as a work project for my students. We read Dracula, Frankenstein, stuff like that, and we discussed the metaphors and themes of those Gothic pieces of literature. So I think that's a little low level for getting a PhD, but you know what? I don't have a PhD. I've never gotten one. I don't know what the process is to get one, so I'll leave that alone. I won't judge you for that. But let's leave that aside. Let's take a look at this. I dug up this professor's profile to learn more about their educational background, and I find this fascinating. It says that she got her PhD in English from the University of California, and it goes on to list her teaching interests, including American literature and culture after 1900, okay, queer studies, fine, cultural studies, okay, critical trauma studies, okay, intersectional feminism, okay, Gothicism, good, and medical humanities. Okay, so far, kind of par for the course, kind of what I was expecting, but scroll down some more, and we hear something fascinating. Listen to this. Quote, her book, Gothic Queer Culture, Marginalized Communities and the Ghosts of Insidious Trauma, proposes the existence of a 20th and 21st century queer culture that responds to and challenges traumatic marginalization by creating a distinctly Gothic aesthetic. Using a cultural studies approach to examine the Gothicism in queer art and literature, liveberry and lesbian pulp fiction, monstrosity and age poetry, sadomasochism and trans performance art, the undead in contemporary film and television, the book argues that queer culture is Gothic at its core, end quote. This portion is rather telling about what kind of metaphors she draws from Gothic culture, art, and literature, and it also tells you where she's most likely going to lead this discussion, but let's see what happens.
Today we'll be looking at depictions of vampires in television and film. This scene is from Nosferatu. Nosferatu is kind of plagiarized. They took the story of Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel that was published in 1897 and made a film that's very closely based on that novel with some slight changes. Nosferatu introduced the concept of the vampire who gets destroyed by sunlight. Dracula can go out during the day. He's fine in the sunshine. There's a scene when the ship, the Demeter, arrives on the shores of Germany, and rats pouring out of the hold of the ship, calling to the idea that when the foreigner comes and arrives into the country, it also brings the plague or contagion. There's a long history of vampires being a metaphor for disease, but also disease was used to kind of explain scientifically what vampire figures might be from. Maybe vampires were actually a figure that represented someone with porphyria, where you can't go outside into sunlight. Or vampires might represent being infected by rabies. And I would not doubt if we get some new vampires coming out of the COVID pandemic to help us understand and grapple with the trauma of global contagion.
Well, yes and no. She says disease was used scientifically to explain where vampires may be from, and there is some truth to that statement. Vampires arose usually out of superstitious fears and a lacking in knowledge about postmodern decay and cultural taboos. Of course, some diseases that people carried would have lended themselves towards a superstition, so that is likely what she's referring to. But she says porphyria, which is a condition where you can't go out in the sunlight. I find this funny because she literally just said that Nosferatu was the vampire who first introduced us to the idea that vampires couldn't walk in the sun. And we know vampires have been known monsters long before that film. I'm not saying she's wrong, but I'm saying that the porphyria connection is likely a more modern connection rather than an ancient one. She then says rabies, which makes a bit more sense, and then she goes on to use COVID to say we may get more vampires from the recent pandemic. But it is here that we hit a wall. Look, despite some modern movies and stories trying to scientifically explain vampirism, like Blade or Morbius, vampires have always leaned more on the side of the supernatural angle, a creature of supernatural or demonic origin. When one wishes to create a monster out of a disease or a pandemic, the classic monster they like to go to is the zombie. Zombies are the undead monster that is far easier to connect to disease, epidemics, and fear of plague, because the zombie, though starting as a supernatural creature, has been largely reimagined into a creature born from the misuse of science or the carelessness of handling pathogens. So, no, I've seen far more jokes about how COVID was going to spark the zombie apocalypse, not a vampire revolution, but guess that's a difference of opinions. I guess you had to have a PhD to be there.
This scene is from Dracula.
It's good to see you back again, Doctor. I heard you have just arrived. And you, Miss Mina, you're looking exceptionally...
Pardon me, Dr. Sewell.
This is a wonderful scene to demonstrate how handsome, how elegant, how seductive Dracula is supposed to be. Bela Lugosi's Dracula was a sexy anti-hero. This is much more in line with John Polidori's version of the vampire than it was with Bram Stoker's, who was a kind of hideous old man. Bela Lugosi's Dracula is the Dracula that we think of when we think of a vampire. The way he sounds, the way he behaves, and that has lingered throughout the rest of the 20th and even 21st centuries. The Count is not reflected in the mirror. This is one of the ways that Van Helsing can affirm with a scientific method that Count Dracula is in fact a vampire. Bram Stoker did a lot of research before he wrote Dracula, and there was what was considered valid scientific research on vampires at the time. So he had access to the idea that was already rooted in other cultures about vampires not liking mirrors or not being reflected in mirrors. It may be that they have no soul. It may be that they hate to see their own face and the way that it represents the ravages of their life as an undead figure, or even as a diseased human. Another idea is that mirrors used to be backed by silver, and as we know, vampires hate silver.
You know, I'm pretty sure it's that first thing, the soul thing, goes back to the old superstition about mirrors. If you break a mirror, it's 7 years bad luck. Want to know why? Because people used to believe that when you look in a mirror, you saw your own soul. And Dracula had no soul and thus couldn't be seen in a mirror. I think that makes way more sense than just saying, oh, silver backing, or, oh, they can't handle their own trauma. No, probably because he doesn't have a soul.
But the idea that Dracula and bats are inextricably linked really comes into the popular imagination with Bela Lugosi's Dracula. That is because there are some really exciting special effects in this movie, and from there on out,
Look out, he'll get in your hair.
Dracula and bats were considered one and the same. This scene is from Dark Shadows.
What were you about to do to me?
Barnabas, please let go of me!
Where are we?
Mausoleum!
Mausoleum? Why was I in this coffin?
We see Barnabas waking up from his death in a coffin, but he doesn't know that he's a vampire yet. He discovers it. The vampire has always been the villain before. In Dark Shadows, we get a vampire who is the lead. He's the one that we sympathize with and introduces the trope of the vampire as protagonist. He's not excited about being a vampire. He's not reveling in it. He has been cursed with vampirism. This is a really important shift when we go from the cautionary tale to the vampire as someone who we might identify with, someone we might sympathize with. It really sparked this moment in pop culture that then led to the Munsters, we have the Addams Family. These are really digestible vampires, and they represent a kind of topsy-turviness in the culture at the time.
You know what? Let's put a pin in that and come back to it. Let's just put that on hold for a second. Firstly, I have not watched Dark Shadows, so I can't speak to the character of Barnabas. But that said, I have watched the Munsters and the Addams Family. They aren't a family of vampires. The Addams Family aren't even conventional monsters. They're just kooky and weird. And as for the Munsters, I think only the wife and grandpa are vampires, and those characters aren't meant to be sympathized with or seen as victims. Like, do you know what these two sitcoms were about?
The hippies, the countercultural movement, we have the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, assassinations of political figures, and everything seems like it has been turned on its head. And so has traditional notions of the domestic, the family. If we think about Leave It to Beaver, this was a family in the 1950s that was supposed to be the pinnacle of suburban family life. And then we move to the Munsters, who are the Leave It to Beaver family flipped on its head.
Well, is it though? I mean, okay, actually the Munsters is essentially every other family sitcom of the time, but with the twist that the family is made up of monsters and they're just trying to fit into a normal society. It's not really flipped on its head by any means, because for that to be the case, the formula has to be a complete opposite. Look, Leave It to Beaver presents an ideal domestic nuclear family dynamic. The Munsters is the story of a family of monsters who want to obtain that despite their differences to society. If you want a show that flips things around, though, look to the Addams Family. Quite literally, the Addams Family is a complete 180 in terms of the average family sitcom. Consider your modern sitcom style. The husband and father is usually the lead character whose antics and actions dictate the course of the show, as he usually gets in over his head thanks to whatever schemes he's cooking up. The wife is usually the voice of reason, trying to talk sense into her husband, and is always there to help him put things back together. The kids have their own separate stories to follow, often dealing with their own struggles and growing up or fitting in. And the extended family are usually burdens or always underfoot, being proverbial punchlines that either help or hurt the plans or actions of the other characters. You see this in shows like Family Guy, for example, or the Lopez Show back in the day. But the Addams Family breaks this mold. The husband always has crazy ideas and schemes, but he's also perfect at everything he does. Everything he tries to invent or create, he is successful at. In fact, there was a joke in one episode where he was upset because the one area he failed at was failure. He could not fail at anything, so he was desperately trying to do things that he would fail at and always succeeded. That was a joke of a whole episode. It was really funny.
Not only does he try to help me, but he gets to enjoy the benefits of a freeway running through his house, and here I sit, a miserable success.
You know, dear, I've been thinking, maybe you have failed.
Querida, stop trying to cheer me up.
No, dear, think about it. Didn't you fail at failing?
Yes, but that's not... Eureka! Eureka! You're right, Tish. I failed at failing.
Meanwhile, his wife doesn't restrict her husband, and the two are actually head over heels for each other. Meanwhile, the kids don't try to fit in, and in fact like being different, as they feel attached to their family and devoted to them rather than being held back. And then the extended family, or Uncle Fester, Lurch, Thing, and Cousin It, are all supportive of the family, and though quirky, don't hinder anyone or anything most of the time. But ironically, the Addams family is not made up of vampires, so I don't know why they're being brought up here. You know what, here's an example that might help. In the opening credits of The Munsters, the little werewolf boy, I forget his name, wants to go to school with his battle axe. His mother snatches it away from him and tells him not to. Why does she do this? Because The Munsters is about a family that wants to be as normal as possible. They want a family like Leave It to Beaver. In the Addams family, Wendy comes home crying one day because at school they read St. George and the Dragon, and in the story the dragon dies. And the family is distraught that they would read such a graphic and tragic story like that to kids. Who would hurt an innocent dragon? Who would do that?
It was terrible. They killed him.
Mr. Hilliard?
The dragon.
What dragon? Who killed the dragon?
A knight in shining armor. He killed the dragon.
I can't believe anyone would kill a dragon.
Poor defenseless dragon.
Perverse barbarism. Such violence. What a estruendo! That settles it. No more school.
And then they insist on meeting with the teacher about the matter. Why? Why would they do that? Because the Addams family don't want to be normal. To them, they already are normal, and the rest of the world is what's odd to them. Now, why did I go into this long explanation? It has nothing to do with vampires. Could I be foreshadowing what's coming later in the video? We'll see.
This scene is from Sesame Street.
I will move each block as I count it.
Oh, no. Ernie asked me to...
1, 2...
The Count is, of course, referring to Count Dracula, but also it's referring to a mythological idea that vampires had to count things if you left them like out in front of your house. People would put grains of rice or beans, hoping to occupy an obsessed vampire who needed to count every grain of rice until they could be captured, killed, or burned up by the sun.
Yes, this was a common myth about Chinese vampires. Is Count the Count Chinese? He does have slanted eyes. Maybe. Ooh, I learned something new. I was not expecting that. Okay, fascinating.
Ernie asked me to...
We do see in Bram Stoker's Dracula that vampires can hypnotize, but this was kind of new science at that time. We use the term mesmerism because that was named after a person named Mesmer who developed this idea of hypnosis. It was something that they were taking pretty seriously at the time as a scientific and medical development. Hypnosis is coming from those scholarly articles that Bram Stoker is researching, and then it comes all the way through to this child's scene from Sesame Street.
Yep, that is 100% accurate. Good, very good job. I appreciate that. That was actually something that was written in Bram Stoker's notes. He brought up hypnotism and mesmerism. Yep, very good.
Anything else?
Well, I mean, you know, Bert and Ernie are gay.
Seriously? No, seriously?
Queer viewers don't need...
No, stop. Seriously? First of all, no, they aren't gay. Second of all, why does it matter if they are? Third, this is a video about vampires. Did we miss that? I will never understand this obsession from people to derail a conversation to insert the moronic talking points into something that has nothing to do with it. We're talking about vampires and the Count in a kid's show, and you just had to add that little portion in. Even were it true, why do you feel the need to add it? Why do you feel the desire to throw that out there? You don't hear me talking about Sohei and Ferran and then going, oh, and Lawbringer is straight. I don't do that. No one does that. The only people who do that are those who are so insecure about their own worldview, they feel the need to constantly draw reference to it. Sorry, you were saying?
Queer viewers don't need the confirmation, right? And this is why LGBTQ folks have always gravitated towards the Gothic and vampires, because these kinds of tropes, they allow for people to do subtextual reading. And because queers have lacked representation, they're really good at finding the subtext. And so we don't always need it to be confirmed that Bert and Ernie are gay lovers, because we've known it since we were 5.
I like how you try desperately to reapply Gothic literature to your little Bert and Ernie bullshit, but it doesn't work. So see, here's the deal. What she said there is fascinating. She says, because there's so little queer representation, queer people have to become good at reading the subtext. First, I'm going to tell you what that statement means from her perspective, and then I'll translate it to what it actually means. What she's trying to say is, because queer people don't have any obvious representation, queer people have had to learn to look deeply into media to find the subtle clues to show that we are actually represented behind the veil, making us very skilled at analysis and understanding of context clues and metaphor in literature and media. That's what she wants to say. But what she actually means is, we don't see enough queer people in media, so we'll read what we want out of a character or relationship to make it queer so that we can see ourselves represented, and if you disagree, we'll call you homophobic for it, and then you can't read the subtext like we can. Well, bad news, sweetheart. Bernie and Ernie ain't queer. They're best friends. And trying to force a subtext does not make you good at finding them. It just means you want something to be there that isn't there. Hate to say it, but go educate yourself.
This scene is from The Hunger.
Is it a love song? I told you. It was sung by 2 women. Sounds like a love song. And I suppose that's what it is.
The Hunger is a goth subcultural classic. You might think that in 1983, this is the first time that culture was ready to see lesbian seduction. That's not really true. Lesbian vampires have been a staple of the vampire genre from almost the beginning. Before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, Sheridan Le Fanu wrote Carmilla, a vampire coming in, preying on a young, innocent girl. And so that links up with films like The Hunger, where the vampire seduction, it's a non-normative sexual seduction. There's a homophobic undertone to these vampire stories where the vampire comes to our attention because they are not straight. The link between the monster and the queer or the lesbian is tied together.
What have you done to me? I've given you something you never dared dream of. What? Everlasting life.
The Hunger is a subpar horror movie that received mixed reviews upon release. The vampire Miriam is an ancient vampire who transformed her lovers into vampires like her, and they would live forever but age rapidly in the end. When their bodies were too decrepit, she would mummify them and put them in coffins for eternity as they moan and wail in eternal damnation. Because they're not actually dead, guys. They're still alive, just mummified, decrepit, unable to move, and in constant pain and torture. But because she's so selfish in her love, she can't put them to rest and allows them to go through this, and then she'll move on to find a new lover. She is a monstrous seductress, and in fact, at the start of the story, we meet her lover at the time, John, who finds out what's happening to him as he starts to age rapidly and tries to undo the curse on him, or at least be killed so he doesn't have to suffer eternal torment. But he is too, stuffed into a coffin, while Miriam goes after her next victim, Sarah. If anything, Miriam is bisexual, but she's still a monster, as she does not mind putting all of her lovers in coffins while she continues to feed on others. In the end, she is killed by Sarah, the woman she is trying to court. Just like what I talked about with Carmilla, we are not drawn to the vampire Miriam because she's lesbian or bisexual. We are afraid of her and hateful towards her because she is a monster who uses and abuses not only her victims, but her lovers, who she turns into victims for her own gain. It's very clear, though, I'll grant you, that The Hunger was inspired by Carmilla, but The Hunger was far more out front about its desire to make the vampire bisexual, whereas with Carmilla, it was not as apparent. Yes, Carmilla hunted after young women to feed on, but it was to maintain her youth and beauty, not out of any genuine sexual desire. She was a seductress for her own personal needs, not a lesbian lover in search of her true love.
This scene is from The Lost Boys.
Guess first. How are those maggots?
The Lost Boys is the vampire film for the MTV generation. It's supposed to be a cautionary tale, but it actually does a great job of getting converts to that youth culture. Like, I want to hang out with the vampires in their lair.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. I would argue that this film really did create a change in the vampire story. This is one of the first films where the vampires are not adults, but young men and women who are living an unconventional and different lifestyle portrayed as troublemakers, motorcyclists, and hoodlums. It's from this film that we see a shift in how vampires are portrayed to being more attractive, more young, and more like subculture society rather than just a singular terrifying monster. You got that right. Agreed with you. Carry on.
It's blood.
Yeah, sure.
Michael is tricked into drinking the blood from the bottle, and therefore he becomes infected. But he does not become a full vampire. They all are half vampires. When we have a half vampire, it highlights this idea that one can have conflict within oneself. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they something in between? We see this also in Blade from 1998, where he also is a half vampire, but he uses those strengths to actually become a vampire hunter. And so this idea that you could start to show something about yourself and then be cured by science or medicine, it really can represent this idea that society tries to police and control non-normative desires. When Michael starts down the path towards being a vampire, does he go forward down the bad path, or does he cure himself of desires that he has started to develop?
You misrepresented the film there. See, let me lay it out for you. Michael, the main character, was tricked into drinking the blood, and now he's a half vampire. He's scared of what's happening to him and wants to change back. He figures out that the only way to turn back is to kill the head vampire of the clan, but if he ever kills a human by feeding, then he'll turn into a full vampire himself. The whole film follows him, his brother, and his other half-vampire friends, like Star, as they battle the Lost Boys and find out who the head vampire is to kill him so they can all go back to normal. I can't help but notice you are, again, trying to apply an LGBTQ undertone to this. You're trying to imply that being a half-vampire is like an awakening to your inner desires and interests and identity that you feel like society is trying to tell you is wrong. So you're conflicted between pursuing your desires, becoming a vampire, or conforming to society, turning back. And given where you obviously lean on that argument, it's clear what you think the character should do. Lean into their desire. You see the vampires in this sense as good. A representation of submitting to your desires and accepting who you are. And yet, the whole point of the Lost Boys was that Michael and company want out of the vampire life because vampirism isn't about sexual identity. It's about being a blood-drinking monster. Oh, and you dragged Blade into this too. Yeah, please don't drag Blade into your bullshit. In fact, Blade is a pretty good line for people like you.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
See, now that's badass.
This scene is from Bram Stoker's Dracula.
You will not by any chance go to sleep in any other part of the castle. Do not put your faith in such trinkets of deceit.
One thing that is not in the novel is the Count shaving Jonathan, which to me is kind of hot.
Yeah, of course you do.
There is something homoerotic about the shaving scene.
Yeah, of course there is. Yeah, sure.
Count Dracula sees the crucifix around Jonathan's neck, and he reacts violently. And this is something that is common to many vampires. They react violently to things affiliated with the church. Some scholars think that vampires dislike crucifixes partially because they could potentially be shaped into a stake that could kill them.
Who the hell said that? What scholar was actually that stupid to present that suggestion? Do I actually have to spell out for you why vampires don't like crucifixes? Do I actually need to explain that to you?
The crucifix may be distasteful to vampires because vampires are demons.
There you go! God, took you a minute, but you figured it out. You know, for a lady who claims to specialize in Gothic metaphor and subtext, you sure couldn't grasp the fucking obvious. Vampires are seen as unholy creatures, beings of undeath that prey upon the living, a complete abomination to the Lord our God, and thus will be repelled by symbols of the Lord. It's amazing to me you could not get that through your head.
Take care how you cut yourself.
This depiction of Dracula is more accurate to the original novel than the 1931 Dracula, though in the original novel he has thick, stout hands with hairs in the center of the palm. It's another way of representing his sexualized perversity.
Ugh, did you really have to draw attention to that detail?
The figure of Count Dracula is inspired by a historical figure. Vlad the Impaler was known as the Impaler because he impaled forests of people around his castle as a warning to those who were coming that he was a harsh and powerful ruler. Generally, this may be one of the more faithful versions of Count Dracula, besides Nosferatu. I think Nosferatu is probably the most faithful. This scene is from Interview with the Vampire.
And then I said farewell to sunlight and set out to become what I became.
Have you said your goodbyes to the light?
Interview with the Vampire is very homoerotic. The gift of vampirism is a metaphor for queer sexuality. Lestat gives Louis the gift of death. The French term for an orgasm is petit mort, the little death. The vampire takes someone to the brink of death, a petit mort, and then brings them back to undeath through the reciprocal exchange of fluids. So it's highly sexualized rhetoric, even if it's not explicitly a sex scene. Interview with the Vampire introduced vampire identity, struggling to come to terms with an identity that was thrust upon him. In the 1990s, this was an era of increasing identity politics, coming to political action from the space of who you are. The latest series from AMC makes some 21st century adaptations. We have a more explicit treatment of race. This film and the novel take place in the South during a time of racial hierarchies. And it's also not just homoerotic, but they are a queer relationship. That's not unusual for vampire stories. They adapt, they shapeshift. It does speak to the enduring nature of the story that Anne Rice originally created in the 1970s.
Sure, yeah, whatever. I never read Anne Rice, nor have I watched The Interview with the Vampire, so I'll just take your word for it. Move on.
This scene is from Let the Right One In.
Tja. Hej. Du måste bjuda in mig.
Vad händer om jag inte gör det? Vad händer om du går in ändå? Finns det något här?
Let the Right One In is a heartwarming and touching version of the vampire tale. We get a tender depiction of young love. The characters face evil, but it's not necessarily from vampires. It is from the bullies that they encounter in their daily life. It is from indifferent and abusive parents, a host of things in normative society. So it's a really interesting take on the way that people can find connection in their outsider status. It also plays more with the question of gender than it does around sexuality.
Får jag chans på dig? Oscar. Jag är ingen flicka.
Nej. Har jag chans på dig eller?
Oscar just wants to be together. And so there's something that transcends gender and sexuality in that moment, that their human and vampire connection is the most important thing.
Question. What does their homosexual desire for each other have to do with vampirism? Couldn't this be a movie about homosexual outcasts who find love together without the vampirism? Why does vampirism matter here in terms of what you're talking about? You're drawing a lot of attention to the relationship between these kids, but the vampirism doesn't seem that important to it. By the way, how young are these kids anyway? Hold on, let me look this up.
Eli does not conform to binary gender. Eli is not human. The status of a vampire as non-human doesn't make them dehumanized and therefore in need of destruction.
Excuse me, what?
Eli is not human. The status of a vampire as non-human doesn't make them dehumanized.
What a beautiful contradictory phrase. Them being a vampire means they are not human. But then in turn, that does not dehumanize them. Well, it kind of does. By the very definition of the term, you have removed the human aspect. I understand what you're trying to say, but that's such a bad way to phrase it. What you should have said is, quote, them being a vampire does not take away from their inward humanity or their need to be treated with humanity. You know, for an English professor, I worry for your students.
It gives them access to a bigger range of experience. There's a shift that goes on in this movie that I find really touching.
Please don't talk about touching when it comes to this movie. It's already in an uncomfortable setup for the age of these kids.
This scene is from Twilight.
You're impossibly fast and strong. You never eat or drink anything. You don't go out in the sunlight. I know what you are.
Say it out loud.
Vampire.
Twilight is an interesting phenomenon. He's not cast as a seductive outsider that we should avoid, but he and his family represent what we should aspire to. They have wealth, they have cars, perfect beauty, they have strength, and maybe most importantly, they have restraint, because they are vegetarian vampires. And this struck a chord. They became such a cultural phenomenon.
Because they're hot. That's the reason. Twilight was written specifically to be a self-insert, hopeless feminine romance story about a girl being swept away by the perfect vampire man who will do anything for her. He's the ideal because there's no drawbacks with him. Yes, he's a vampire, but he loves me and he'll protect me. He can go out in the sun because he doesn't burn up, but he's beautiful. Sure, he hungers for blood, but he controls himself. All for me. It's all some girl's wet dream made manifest. It's not about us aspiring to be Edward. It's about girls wanting guys like Edward. That's why it became a cultural phenomenon, because it appealed to the lovesick teen girl who yearns for that kind of fiction.
The Twilight vampires align with a lot of the depictions that we've seen throughout the centuries. In other ways, they diverge.
Wait, hold on. So the Twilight vampires align with a lot of depictions we see throughout the centuries, but in other ways they diverge. So, they're like other vampires, but in other ways they're not like other vampires.
True. You know what else that actually applies to?
Again, a better way to phrase this would be, the vampires in Twilight try to align with various other mythological representations of vampires, but try to be distinct by diverging in certain areas, thus making them both recognizable as vampires, but still unique to the world in which they are written. Again, English professor, come on.
When we get to Twilight, vampires technically can go out in the sun. It doesn't weaken them, but it does expose them for their true nature. Their diamond skin, however, plays right into that same idea that they represent the pinnacle of status, beauty. They pull Bela Lugosi's class and wealth together with the Lost Boys' flashy youth culture and create this new monster that everybody wants to either be or be with. They are the pinnacle of 21st century capitalist aspirations.
What does capitalism have to do with this? Where the hell did that come from?
This scene is from What We Do in the Shadows.
My name is Colin Robinson, and I am what's known as a psychic vampire or energy vampire. Energy vampires drain people's energy merely by talking to them.
Actual versus budget year to date? No thanks. You're going to be at that all day.
What We Do in the Shadows is a satire of the vampire genre. Colin Robinson, he breaks all of the vampire tropes that we're used to seeing, except that he feeds on people's energy. This is something that occurs very frequently in relation to vampires. That's one reason why tuberculosis was associated with vampires. Tuberculosis was called consumption because it was like you were being drained or consumed slowly over time, wasting away. The vampires in the household are anachronistic. They're out of step with time. And this is a knowing, like tongue-in-cheek callback to the idea that vampires are primitive. Count Dracula is coming from a town where everyone is uncivilized and superstitious. The show knows that it is satirizing the racist and imperialist implications of vampires as out of step with time.
Yes, let's throw buzzwords at everything and hope it sticks. You know what, let's re-listen to that and see if it makes any sense.
The show knows that it is satirizing the racist and imperialist implications of vampires as out of step with time.
How is it racist and imperialist that vampires are out of step with time? Dracula was not out of step with time. Carmilla was not out of step with time. None of the vampires you've talked about are out of step with time. And even if they were, why is that racist or imperialist?
Living forever doesn't make you glamorous. It makes you out of touch, like a dad times 1,000.
Living forever doesn't make you glamorous. It makes you out of touch. And that's a bad thing to say to portray vampires? It's racist and imperialist to assume that a man who has lived forever and been isolated from humanity, except to feed, might be out of touch and with how the world works? That's a confusing stance to take. Oh, and like a dad times 1,000, don't insult fathers around me. Even the most out-of-touch dad knows more about the function of the world than you do.
This scene is from Morbius.
Oh, hell yeah, it's Morbin time!
Yesterday, I could barely walk. Today, I don't know what I'm capable of.
Like Barnabas, Morbius is discovering what it means to be a vampire. He didn't become a vampire as a curse. He became a vampire through technology, through treatment of a disease. But we still see him learning about himself. Morbius may have more of a through line to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which the protagonists encounter the unintended and sometimes terrifying consequences of technology. You're trying to solve something and not recognizing what might happen as a result. And that's really a present cultural anxiety, especially around climate change and perhaps the fantasy that it changes someone into somebody who has superhuman capabilities is a fantasy that people need to see right now. Because if they're going to be subject to these forces outside of their control, they want to at least imagine that they're going to come out the better for it.
Yep. Seems legit. See, you can do decent criticism and analysis when you aren't trying to force your political gender identity views on things.
Vampires are an enduring concept because they express the complexity of what it means to be someone who's different, but also someone who is beautiful and powerful in that difference, even if it can't be understood or appreciated by the dominant culture. I'm Dr. Laura Westengard. Thanks for watching.
And we're finally done. We finally finished it. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So, vampires. I'm a huge fan of vampires as a monster. One of the cool things about writing vampires or about reading vampires is because vampires can be used for so many different things. Yes, as this woman demonstrated, they can be used as metaphors for sex or sexual desire or things like that. I prefer to see them as monsters, be they supernatural, evil, demonic entities, or relatable, understandable creatures that are dangerous but still have a heart to them. I'm in the middle of writing a story right now called The Revenant King, which is kind of a mix of the two. It's about Dracula as he's come into the modern day. It's kind of a mix of who he was historically combined with who he was in the book and what he wants to be now as he tries to fight an ancient evil that's coming. Like, I don't want to spoil too much, but essentially the idea is that Dracula has shown up because when he was Vlad Tepes and he had a younger brother named Radu and him both turned into vampires while they were with the Ottoman court as slaves. Radu became quite evil and dangerous and has been spreading his seed to try to create a generation of vampires. Meanwhile, he, Dracula, is trying to put an end to them, and there's a whole lot of intrigue. He has to work with this cop who has her own baggage to carry. It's really, really cool. I've been enjoying working on it. It's been a lot of fun. But the idea is, just because he's a vampire, I get to play around with some of his powers, some of his experiences, some of the things that he's looking for and looking forward to, some of his fears and concerns and self-loathing. There's a lot there that I enjoy playing with. The ways that you can write and read vampires is almost limitless. It's a creative outlet for horror writers, fantasy writers, romance writers. There's a lot of ways you can approach the vampire. This woman chose one way and stuck with it. I wouldn't call her a vampire expert. In fact, I'd hesitate to call her a Gothic literature expert, because all she really proved to me is that she picked a bunch of vampire movies and TV shows and did her damnedest to try to tie them into her LGBTQ and social justice lens. It's really cringe. There were some vampire movies I was actually looking forward to seeing what she had to say about, like 30 Days of Night. That would have been interesting. The Demeter, that would have been interesting. I could have seen her talk about the Castlevania Netflix series. That would have been interesting. The Alucard, the Hellsing anime, that would have been interesting. You could have gone to a lot of different areas, but I guess you didn't want to because those don't jump right into your political social justice lens. Lady, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. Stick to gender studies classrooms. Don't be an English professor. Stick to gender studies classrooms. It's where you're gifted. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care.